Ms. Faye, and today we're going to be covering an introduction to genetics. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to cover the following learning targets, including I can define genetics, heredity, traits, genes and alleles, and genome, define and give an example of genotype and phenotype, explain how a gene, a locus, and allele are related, identify and define the two types of alleles, including dominant and recessive, explain how many traits an offspring receives from each parent as a result of sexual reproduction, and finally, distinguish between homozygous and heterozygous alleles. Now, genetics is defined as a study of inheritance patterns, meaning it is the study of the traits and the genes and pieces of DNA that is passed from parent to offspring. Okay, we all know that in a sexually reproducing organisms, an organism will inherit 50% of their DNA or 50% of their chromosomes from one parent, and then the other half comes from the other parent. Essentially what's happening here is that the organism is receiving some genes from one parent and or some versions, okay, or alternate form of that gene from one parent and one alternate form of the gene from another. And a gene, if you remember, is a piece of DNA that provides a set of instructions for making a protein. If we look at a picture of a chromosome, we know that the sections of a chromosome, each section of that chromosome is known as a gene, or it basically is one gene, and there are hundreds of these genes on a particular chromosome, and every gene is responsible for creating a specific protein. So a gene might be responsible for making hair texture curly or straight. A gene might be responsible for eye color. A gene might be responsible for having dimples, having freckles, etc. So all of these traits, which are inherited characteristics that we see physically, are determined by genes. So a trait is a characteristic that we can physically see in a person, such as height or hair color or hair texture or eye color, etc. A gene we cannot see, it's in the DNA, it's on the chromosomes, and it is inherited from the parent, okay? However, a gene will determine a characteristic. A gene will determine a trait. And a gene also encodes for specific proteins which help to exhibit that trait or determine that trait. All of an organism's genetic material is known as a genome. So humans have a specific genome. Cats have another genome. So depending on the organism, that organism will have a different genome. All right. So it's essentially all of the genetic material that the organism possesses. And a genotype is basically referring to the genetic makeup of the organism or the genetic makeup of a specific gene. And we usually represent that with a letter, okay? And these letters are arbitrary, meaning we choose any letter we want. It's not like a specific gene has to be represented by a specific letter. A phenotype is a physical expression or appearance of a trait. Now, these words I want you to pay attention to because we're going to be hearing them over and over again throughout this entire unit. Genotype, and we can see that the word gene exists in this word, is the gene, is the genetic makeup. Phenotype, okay, physical, physical. Phenotype is the physical expression or trait that we see, such as having blue eyes or being tall or short, having curly hair, wavy hair, having freckles, having dimples, not having dimples, etc. All of these are phenotypes. These are traits, and they are determined by a person's genotype, or genes, which we cannot see because they are found on the chromosomes, they are found on the DNA. If we were to take a chromosome, and if you remember from before, we said that each one of these is known as a chromatid, right? It's essentially a half of a chromosome. And on a specific chromosome, we will have a location on that chromosome that basically is where the gene is located, all right? And if you remember, a chromosome, which usually looks like an X, okay, it's represented by an X, has two sides. Each one of those sides, we said, is one chromatid, and together they are sister chromatids. Now, you receive half of your chromosomes from one parent, from mom, half of your chromosomes from dad, meaning you have two basically not copies because they're not identical, but two versions of a very similar chromosome, and this is known as a homologous chromosome. Okay, homologous chromosomes are chromosomes that are not identical because they came from two different people, but they contain the same genes. So, for example, these are homologous chromosomes. This one might have come from mom. This one might have come from dad. You inherited it from each one you've inherited from one parent. On both of these homologous chromosomes, you will find a gene, many genes, but you will find a specific gene located at a specific location or address known as a locus. Okay, so a locus is essentially the address of a specific gene on a homologous chromosome. So on mom's chromosome, this would be the address for example, eye color. Now, in this example, they tell you that this is the allele for purple flowers because these are the chromosomes, I guess, of a flower. Okay, again, it doesn't have to be human. All organisms have DNA and chromosomes. So, in this particular organism, in this particular plant, one homologous chromosome contains let's say that this came from the female flower, and it contains the gene for purple flowers. The other homologous chromosome, or the other, homologous chromosome contains the gene for flower color, but here it's coding for white flowers. Notice that both of these genes that are responsible for determining the color of the flower are on the same location, the same locus, okay? But because they came from two different flowers, okay, a female and a male, let's assume, they come in two different varieties. So this one is purple, gives us the expression of a purple flower. This one gives us the expression of a white flower. Now, since both of them are the same gene, they both code for flower color, but they come in two different varieties, we refer to them as alleles. So an allele is a variation of the same gene. So a gene, if it's located on the same place in two homologous chromosomes, that is known as an allele. And its place, its address, its location on the homologous chromosome is known as a locus. So in one of the learning targets, you were asked to basically relate the terms gene, locus, and allele together. This is how we do it. A gene is you can say it's a segment on a chromosome. A locus is the location of the gene on a homologous chromosome, and an allele is a variation of that gene. Okay, so in this case, we saw two different variations, purple and white. And what is the gene? Flower color. Okay, now cells, here I say that cells have two alleles for each gene, one from each parent. So every cell in your body contains two alleles because you got half of your chromosomes from one parent and the half from the other parent, and therefore you have two versions of every gene, okay? Two versions for every gene. Now, which one you end up exhibiting, that's going to be determined by something which we will talk about next. So, even though you have two versions, so let's say, for example, that my mom had green eyes, my dad had brown eyes, and even though I inherited the green-eyed allele from mom and the brown-eyed allele from dad, my eyes turned out to be brown, okay? How is that possible? How come my eyes did not turn to be green, okay? Why are they brown? Well, this goes to the concept that every allele that you have in your body, in your cells, can be one of two varieties. It can either be a dominant allele, meaning that it will be expressed as a phenotype. And remember, phenotype is physical, so it is what we can actually see as a trait. So if the allele is dominant, then it will essentially mask the other allele, and it will be present. It will show as a phenotype. And it will show as long as there is at least one allele, one dominant allele present. All right? So if I was to represent this dominant gene that determines brown eyes in a letter, let's say I choose R, okay? And if it is a dominant allele, I represent it with a capital letter. Okay, so all dominant alleles, all dominant genes are represented by a capital letter. This tells us when I look at the gene, I know it's a dominant allele because it's represented by a capital letter. So brown eyes in this example that I'm giving you would be represented by, let's say, capital R or capital B. Let's make it easier and I'll say capital B. All right, so if remember that each person gets 2 alleles for each gene. Okay, not 1, 2. So if both of these alleles are dominant, meaning they're brown, capital B, then for sure my eyes will be brown. Okay? If one of them is capital B, meaning brown, but then the other one came from mom and she had green eyes. Okay, so it's not going to be capital B. To distinguish it, I'm going to make it a lowercase b. And therefore, basically, it's going to be represented by a lowercase b. So now I have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. And as long as I have one dominant allele present, that is the trait that's going to show. Okay? So what am I saying here? I'm saying that let me make this even easier for you. If this is my genotype, let's start to use these words, okay? If this is my genotype, as you can see, for sure my eyes are going to be brown. If this is my genotype, even though we have the non-brown-eyed allele, I'm representing it with a lowercase b to say that, hey, this is not brown, this is another color, in this case green, in my example. Even if both of these variations exist, my eyes will still be brown, because in a dominant allele, as long as you have at least one allele present and it is dominant, that trait will show. Okay? And that is why my eyes are brown. Even though I might have this genotype, even though I might have my mom's green-eyed allele in my genes, in my DNA, or on my chromosomes, I'm still not going to have green eyes because that dominant brown-eyed allele exists, and it kind of like masks or hides the recessive allele from being shown. Now, when can a recessive allele be shown? So a recessive allele, first of all, is an allele that has to be present, or 2 copies of it have to be present in order for it to be expressed. All right? So usually represent recessive alleles with a lowercase letter, and it is only shown as a phenotype, as a physical trait, when 2 copies of it are present. So in the example of my mom's green eyes, by the way, my mom doesn't have green eyes. This is just an example. So in that example, let's say I inherited the following genotype, okay? 2 lowercase b, meaning 2 alleles for green eyes. My dad somehow in his lineage had green eyes, even though he doesn't show green eyes, he still had it hidden in his DNA, and I got that copy from him, and I got the green-eyed allele from mom. So now I have 2 green-eyed alleles represented by the lowercase b, and guess what? My eyes would be green because that allele, I have 2 copies of it, and therefore it will be expressed. Okay? All right, so just to kind of recap the difference between a dominant allele and a recessive allele, a dominant allele is expressed even if it is paired with another recessive allele. A recessive allele is only visible when it is paired with another recessive allele. So in the case of this example, it says that the effect of a dominant allele, capital B, are seen even if it is present with a contrasting recessive allele. So in this case, capital B causes brown fur in cats. Lowercase b causes gray fur in cats. As you can see, the cat with the following genotype, 2 dominant, okay? If we see a capital, right away we want to say dominant, okay? We need to learn to speak in this terminology, or using these terminologies. So this type of this cat has 2 dominant alleles, and therefore it is brown, because capital B is brown and lowercase b is gray. The dominant allele is brown, the lowercase allele, the recessive allele is gray. Therefore, the first cat definitely going to be brown. The second cat, even though it has that recessive allele hidden or present in its genotype, it's still going to be considered, or it's still going to show the dominant color, okay, the dominant trait. Because like we said, as long as there is one dominant allele present, the dominant trait will show. In the last example, we see a cat with 2 recessive, lowercase, 2 recessive alleles, meaning for sure it's going to be gray. And that is the only time that the recessive allele is going to show, because it's paired with another recessive allele. One thing I want to point out, when we are kind of like looking at examples later on of genotypes and phenotypes, when we're dealing with one example, the dominant and the recessive allele of that specific gene must be represented with the same letter. So I can't represent the dominant brown fur allele with a capital B and then represent the recessive gray fur with a G, just because it's gray G. You can't do that, okay? The dominant, so if we're talking about the same gene, and here the gene is responsible for what? Fur color, okay? So since this gene is responsible for fur color, we have to treat it with the same letters. The dominant version, the dominant allele of this gene responsible for fur color is represented with a capital B, and the recessive allele for this gene responsible for fur color is represented with a lowercase b. Again, they have to match. Just wanted to point that out for you. So the last thing I want to talk about, is it the last thing? Yes, it is the last thing. So the last thing I want to talk about is another kind of like terminology that we need to get used to using, and it is the terms homozygous and heterozygous. Right away, we know that the prefix homo means same, and the prefix hetero means different, and we already talked about that in a lot of words and terminologies that we've discussed in the past. Now, a homozygous allele, okay, if we say that something is homozygous, that describes 2 alleles that are the same at the specific locus. All right, so what do I mean? This is, first of all, what kind, let's look at this example. This is a genotype, okay, genotype, because it's the letters. In this particular example, in this genotype, first of all, is this dominant or recessive? Let's look at it. It's represented by a capital letter, and therefore this means it is dominant. Now, since we have 2 copies of a dominant allele, we refer to this as homozygous dominant. Homozygous telling us that there's 2 copies, and dominant meaning that both of these copies are dominant. Okay, so this genotype, if I ask you, what is this genotype? You would tell me homozygous dominant. Okay, so this is homozygous dominant. Okay, now what about this one? This one is also homozygous, because you can see that there's 2 copies, but is it dominant? Is the genotype that is being shown dominant? 2 lowercase r's? No, that is a recessive allele. And therefore, we will, if I was to ask you what kind of genotype is this, you would respond by saying it is homozygous recessive. Homozygous because there's 2 copies and they're identical. Recessive because those copies are lowercase. They are recessive alleles. What about this? What about this example? Okay, notice that in this case, the genotype contains 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. What would we refer to something like this? Something like this would be referred to as heterozygous. And we don't say, like you wouldn't say heterozygous recessive, heterozygous dominant. No, you would just say that it is heterozygous, okay? And any organism with this particular genotype, we consider this particular genotype a hybrid, meaning that it has half of the alleles are, or half of the allele is recessive and the other half is dominant, okay? Notice that in all of these examples, these alleles are present on the same locus. So on the same locus, this is an example of a homozygous. Notice how they're exactly the same. They could be dominant or recessive. This is an example of a heterozygous. Okay? I hope that was clear. Please let me know if you have any questions and if you need me to kind of go over something in particular. Especially with, these terms, they can get a bit confusing. Moving forward, we're going to be using this terminology. So it's very important that you have this down before we move on to the next topic. Have a great day.